Thank you very much for the kind introduction. On behalf of UN Environment, let me first thank the organizers of this conference and the co-owners of the conference series with whom we have worked for a number of years on this conference and other conferences. Before I go too far, I want to extend a special thanks to many of you have had lots of contacts here, but at least for the speakers and those of us who have had kind of a long-standing relationship with the conference organizers, the secretariat of this conference, Ms. Heidi Hugh, Ms. Kathy Chan, Ms. Janet Tang, Ms. Carmen Lau, Ms. Sophie Fung, and their team, which really did most of the work putting this together. And those are often the overlooked women who have made this all come together. I also want to thank the interpreters before I go too far. Those of you who would rather hear me in Mandarin, you will appreciate the interpreters because I will sound far more articulate in Mandarin than I do in English. We heard yesterday a lot about the potential for the building sector as it relates to climate change, and you'll hear more from Christiana FIGUERES later in this session. She gave a very inspiring speech yesterday. I hope it motivated all of us to get more involved and more active. But this session really will start with hearing a little bit more about what's happening in Hong Kong. We heard a lot about the great work that's going on in Hong Kong. And to start, I'll kind of dispense with long introductions of our speakers and get right to them so that you can hear them rather than me. But we'll hear more from the Ministry of Environment, from Hong Kong SAR. And let me introduce, if I could, Mr. WONG Kam-sing, who's Secretary of the Environment for the Government of Hong Kong Special Administrative Region. He's been in this position since July of 2012. He's an architect by training, and I think you will enjoy his presentation. Mr. Wong.
Good morning, KK Conrad Bay. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. As introduced by the moderator, I was an architect focusing on SBE in the past 2 to 3 decades. Attended many of the World SBE conference in the past. So welcome all of you on behalf of the Hong Kong SAR government to join this World SBE conference in Hong Kong. Firstly, I would like to say some thank you. Thank you, Hong Kong GBC, CIC, in organizing this event in Hong Kong. In particular, since Christiana yesterday said thank you to Mr. Trump, I would like you to join me to say thank you to Christiana. She is the lady behind Paris Agreement, and welcome you to attend this first World SBE conference right after the Paris Agreement. Today, I would like to share with you some ideas and actions in Hong Kong, in particular in the past 5 years since I took up this position as the Minister on the Environment. The picture here shows a video that we produced for Hong Kong people using the traditional Chinese Monkey King as a kind of representation to showcase how people can fight against climate change. In view of time, I'm not going to show you the video, but it's on the, our website about climate change, so welcome you to look at it. Some of you may have been to the previous World SBE conference. You may note that in most of the World conference in the past were held in September or October. This is the first time to organize this World Conference in June. I'm not sure whether you understand the difference. It's because probably it's the best time for you to experience global warming in Hong Kong. Hong Kong is belonging to the subtropical climate, and similar to many other cities, it's getting hotter and hotter. It's not the hottest day in Hong Kong, okay? But you can taste that Hong Kong is facing the extreme weather in relation to climate change, getting more humid and hotter. Today, I would like to share with you in two parts. What are the key ideas? This World Conference has been for almost 20 years. It's time for us to look back to see what are the key ideas that we have learned and look forward. What are the key ideas towards the mid of this century? Certainly, through this conference, there will be more ideas, but I would like to share with you two key ideas. Firstly, it's about the term SBE. In the past, when we look back all these World Conference from Green Building Challenge 98, initiated by Waco and Niels Larsen, almost 20 years ago, and then held in Maastricht. And after that World Conference, people started to change the name from GB to SB. Okay, there are academic reasons that the way and others can explain. But it's the first time that this World Conference used the name SBE, that it should mean something, okay? So let's consider. Throughout this timeline, almost 20 years, from 98 and to now, we are improving our understanding about green building, SB, SBE. And I would share with you more how I and Hong Kong people are seeing SBE in relation to the very important new idea, Paris Agreement in response to climate change. I represent Hong Kong to attend the China delegation to Paris to attend the UN Climate Summit. I met Christiana and other people. I got to see the Paris Agreement that would frame our forthcoming worldview about SBE in the forthcoming decades. In particular, we try to translate the Paris Agreement into something that Hong Kong people, including officials, developers, and laymen can understand. We translate into a kind of 40 ideas. That means Paris Agreement set a target is to limit the global temperature rise not more than 2 degrees C when compared with the pre-industrial temperature, and set a timeline is to keep that change by mid of this century, and through a transparent system, work together among all the countries except a few. So that's set the kind of new perspective for policymakers and professionals to work on SBE. And in the forthcoming time, I would like to share with you what are the policies and politics involved and considered in the context of Hong Kong. Hong Kong is a special city. You can feel the density. Country Park is not far away. The urbanized area is only about 20–25%. From my home or from many people's home in Hong Kong, a few minutes walk, or by subway, we can go to Country Park. And this picture highlights people, okay? It's because when we talk about SBE, it's not only about concrete, steel, glass, but also about cultural transformation. And that's what our policies are working on. And Hong Kong is a compact city. There are merits and also constraints. After Paris Agreement, we returned to Hong Kong. There are a number of policy changes in the 1 to 2 years. One is that we set up a new working group among the Works Department and using the latest scientific data to gauge and forecast what are the forthcoming extreme weathers and related impacts that would affect our infrastructure, buildings, and the built environment. One thing is about the temperature, as I highlighted earlier. In the past, from 1966 to 2005, they observed extremely warm and humid days that are shown in the orange and red, okay? It seems already quite impactful to Hong Kong people. But the forecast is telling us that by mid of this century, from 2051 to 2060, and then the last bar, end of this century, there will be more extremely warm and humid days. And even worse, they would come in consecutive time. That would be very harmful to public health and even about life and death. Okay, certainly there will be more data about rising sea level, about rainfalls, etc. Okay, I'm not going to bore you. We are putting all those data on our centralized Climate Ready at Hong Kong website. That is a means that we'd like to better inform people, professionals, developers, and the general public. As said by the Chief Secretary Matthew yesterday, after the Paris Agreement, we set up a new Steering Committee on Climate Change, chaired by himself, attended by all the ministers in Hong Kong, from education, development to innovation and technology, etc. We all work together. Internally, we form a closer partnership to combat climate change. And before the Paris meeting, we launched Hong Kong's first ever energy saving plan 2015 to 2025 plus, set a new aggressive target in terms of energy intensity reduction, higher than the other APEC cities, even though Hong Kong's current energy intensity is the lowest compared with other APEC economies and all European economies. But we'd like to be even further and more aggressive. And after the Paris Agreement, we formed the SCCC, Steering Committee on Climate Change, and work together, engage the public, stakeholders, and formulate the Hong Kong's Climate Action Plan 2030 plus. This is the cover of the, we call it CAP 2030 plus. All the information are available on the climateready.gov.hk website. We also have a kind of simple leaflet to show what are the targets, what are the mitigation strategies, adaptation, and resilience. To respond to climate change is not only about decarbonization, but also how to make our built environment more climate adaptive and resilient, both in terms of hardware and software. And also, outside this venue, we have the Environment Bureau's booth. Welcome you to understand more about our plan. Hong Kong's strategy should be based on the local situation. So the carbon footprint is a kind of metrics for us to develop further. You can see that Hong Kong having a special kind of economic structure and situation. So you can see that the biggest footprint is related to the electricity generation, 70%. And 90% of the power consumption are used in buildings like this, for space cooling, lighting, etc. So buildings are very important in Hong Kong, accounting for about 60% of Hong Kong's carbon footprint. So if we talk about green building, SBE, buildings are really the focus. And transportation, 60% is relatively low when compared with other global cities, but we'd like to further reduce its carbon footprint. And others are waste and others. So our climate action plan are focusing on these four areas: supply side of energy, green building, transportation, waste reduction. And Hong Kong's, in the recent years, the average per year's carbon footprint is 6.2 tons. Okay, it's higher than mainland China. Compared with other global cities, there are room for improvement. And on top of that, it's not only about climate. We like to promote integration and innovation. So while we would like to reduce the carbon footprint in relation to these four areas, we'd like to take the opportunity to see the co-benefits. For instance, we'd like to improve the air quality locally. At the same time, we'd like to improve the transportation's energy use. So there would be multiple benefits that we'd like to seize through a single policy. And it's important for Hong Kong people or for mainlanders, they will feel air quality would be more closer to them. So in terms of politics, in terms of policy formulation and communication, that we should have a strategy to tell people. But at the same time, behind the communication, we understand that we would like to address all these issues, local issues, global issues together on waste, on air quality, on the energy supply, energy saving, and climate adaptation and resilience. The plan tells the new target, currently 6.2 tons per capita, and the previous target is to reduce the per capita footprint to around 4.5 tons by 2020. That means 3 years' time. The new target is to reduce it further to around 3 point something by 2030. In terms of intensity, it's about 65 to 70%. In terms of absolute reduction, it's about 26 to 36%. And we try to communicate through the 4T strategy, as said earlier: target, timeline, transparency, and together. In terms of mitigation, to echo the footprint metrics, supply side is very important. Hong Kong is going to phase out all the coal-fired power plants in a decade's time, and to have more renewable energy. But Hong Kong is facing constraints because due to the geographical area and also the availability of renewable energy, we may have to consider further how we can further improve the mix of the renewable energy, probably through cross-border collaboration, etc. At the same time, I said earlier, green building energy savings are very important in Hong Kong. So we are setting a new energy intensity target and to promote through these 4T partnerships. I will tell you more. And then low carbon transportation and waste less. To show you some figure about the low carbon transportation in Hong Kong, these figures contain many data, but you can see that the bottom, among the, say, 44 global cities, Hong Kong's transportation energy use and the mix is probably something that we can be proud of. For instance, you can see that the bottom line is that the blue line shows the private car usage, the green shows the transit, and the purple shows the walkability. So you can see that in Hong Kong, we are having the highest use of mass transit and walkability. That's why we have the lowest energy use in both public and private modes of transportation. But more that we should do is about the supply and demand side of power and building. So as I said, we are working on the power companies. We just renewed the contract or the agreement with the two power companies. So in the next 15 years, the power companies will be more supportive to renewable energy, not only centralized ones, but also distributed ones integrated with buildings, and also to promote energy saving in collaboration, in partnership with the building owners to save energy. And then we have the 4T approach to promote green buildings. And we have a map to show across the territory how we promote SBE, from buildings, from energy supply, transportation, and waste reduction together. It's a holistic view. And then you can zoom into the neighborhood level. A showcase is the Kai Tak, is where the old airport was located. A few highlights. It's the first district that we promote district cooling. It's far more energy efficient. At the same time, it can make the urban climate better because instead of individual space cooling associated with buildings, we can get rid of all of them. And the individual building's roof can support more greening, more public space. The whole space urban heat island effect could be reduced. At the same time, the roof, the space can support more renewable energy, greening, public space, etc. So it's a showcase how we are working on the neighborhood. And it's also the area using the urban climatic mapping design. The air ventilation is very important for Hong Kong, while shading, greening to cool, and also to invite more wind into the urban areas. As, under the research of Professor Edward is here, that is the first area to showcase this kind of bioclimatic study at a neighborhood scale in the context of Hong Kong, given its high density and subtropical climate. And also smart city technology that tomorrow the Secretary for Development will tell you more about how we can have a smart city on the hardware and software to promote a low carbon living. And then down to new building and existing buildings level, those have been talking for a long time. and we have a strategy and blueprint. One thing that I would like to highlight is that, as said by Matthew yesterday, we are going to have more public housing, new public housing in Hong Kong, and also more hotels, more hospitals and others. All these are to be green buildings. We have the internal government policy to require that the new government buildings to be at least the second highest level under Hong Kong's BEAM Plus certification. So it's not only for officials, but also for the grassroots peoples. They are living in public housing, have to enjoy green building, and also existing buildings as well. Lastly, I would like to share with you that we are launching this new document yesterday or today. It's the deepening energy saving in EB, existing buildings through the 4T partnership. Hong Kong's having a number of high-rise buildings, probably the largest number in the world, facing different challenges. But we are having the 4T partnership, is that we talk with the biggest developers in Hong Kong. Although they only occupy 1 to 2% of the building stock in Hong Kong, but in terms of energy use, they represent 20 to 30% of the total energy consumption in Hong Kong. So that would be a very effective way, strategically, to talk with them, having the partnership. So this picture shows that the government, the coastal government, and the commercial buildings are working together through this 4T partnership. On one hand, to set a new target together in the, say, forthcoming 5 years, we can reduce our energy use. At the same time, promote green building certification, virtual commissioning, virtual fitting, etc. So the result is that in the forthcoming 5 years, through this partnership, we can further reduce Hong Kong's total energy use by 5% through their energy reduction. Lastly, I would like to say that Paris Agreement is good for Hong Kong, good for other cities. That will make our cities great again, happier, healthier, economically better. So with that, I would like you to enjoy the conference, and Hong Kong may contribute to you for this 4T partnership and interpretation of the Paris Agreement. And it's important that we have to work together, be climate ready, and don't be a big waster. Thank you, all of you again. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Wong. All of us who were here yesterday heard the passion and saw the force that helped bring the world together around the Paris Agreement. It would have been easy for Ms. Figueres to rest on her laurels and on that accomplishment. But as she advised us yesterday, we shouldn't be looking in the rearview mirror, we should be looking forward. And so she is now the Vice Chair of the Global Covenant of Mayors for Climate and Energy, and the former Executive Secretary of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. And we are excited to hear more from her this morning. Ms. Figueres.
Well, good morning to all of you again. I'm delighted to be here, and thank you for a second very, very inspiring presentation. We heard it yesterday from Matthew, and today from you, Minister. Thank you very much for truly raising the flag of what cities can do, and in particular what urban areas can do, because I do think that that's where the future is being constructed, as I mentioned to you yesterday. So thank you very much for inspiring us. Dear friends, this morning's session seeks to bring together sustainable development and climate, which is a kind of a dumb thing to say, because sustainable development and climate are not apart from each other. They're actually one and the same. So let me just go through that a little bit so that we have that clear. We do have, as you know, after a lot of work, 17 Sustainable Development Goals that were adopted by the governments of the world under the banner of the United Nations in 2015, just a few months before the Paris Agreement. What is interesting to note about these 17 is first that we all have to increase our memory capacity so that we can remember all 17. I won't test you right now. But secondly, that it's very interesting the relationship between most of these, not all of them, but between most of these and climate. And let me explain. Some of these sustainable development goals, the way we attack them or address them will determine whether we're actually able to meet the climate commitment that we have. And some of them will depend on meeting that climate commitment. So here's what I mean. Depending on what we do with energy, depending on what we do with land use, depending on what we do with consumption and production patterns, and depending on what we do with our cities, 4 of the very important SDGs, those 4 will determine whether we meet the climate target of being a decarbonized society by 2050 or not, through those 4 SDGs. So already we understand that those 4 SDGs are not separate from climate at all. In fact, it is through those 4 that we actually reach the climate targets of the Paris Agreement. Conversely, if and only if we reach the decarbonization targets that we have, will we be able to achieve a very important subset of other SDGs. Only if we address climate in time will we be able to protect public health. Only if we reach the climate targets on time will we be able to protect our oceans. Only if we reach them on time will we have enhanced food security. Only if we do climate change on time will we have peace in the world. And perhaps the most important, certainly to me, only if we do our job on climate change do we stand any chance of eradicating extreme poverty on the face of this earth. And those are 6 other sustainable development goals. So if 4 of them determine climate change and 6 of them depend on climate change, then I think you understand that actually almost the whole family, with few exceptions, of SDGs are actually interlinked and intertwined with climate. And that is actually a good thing, because we would not want these to be separate from each other or actually to be competing with each other. We do want these to be integrated so that the human effort to address these will actually have benefits across several sectors of the human endeavor and across quite a few of the SDGs. Having said all of that, now let me make a counterpoint. None of the SDGs that I have mentioned to you, nor the others that I haven't mentioned, have an inbuilt timing constraint except climate. Climate change is the only SDG, the only one, that has a physical limit and a timing attached to it. What I mean by that is that on a moral basis, obviously we should eradicate poverty not tomorrow, but today. But there is no physical constraint to that. And the same case can be made for most of the other SDGs. Climate has an inbuilt timing to it because climate comes up against the physical constraint of what the global atmosphere can bear. So think of this as though we had a big bathtub and we're filling up the bathtub. The bathtub is the atmosphere. Well, the fact is that throughout the human experience, as long as we humans have been here, we have already filled up that bathtub to 2/3 its level. And we only have about 1/3 left of that volume, of greenhouse gas emission volume, that we can put into that bathtub, talk about the atmosphere, without it beginning to spill over into very, very dangerous areas that are actually irreversible. That means that we only have 600 gigatons of CO2 left, not for 1 decade, not for 1 century. No, we have 600 gigatons that we can still emit into the atmosphere for the rest of the history of mankind. Now, I don't know how many of you have already made reservations to leave planet Earth. I have not. I am definitely staying here. But please let us understand, as long as we intend to stay here, and the planet will go on perfectly well without us and after us. That's not the issue. The issue is the human experience and the quality of life of humans on this planet. So as long as we intend to be on this planet, we only have 600 gigatons left. Now, you may think 600 gigatons is actually a lot. Well, maybe it's not. Because do you know how much we're putting out every year? 40. Now, I don't know what math is in Hong Kong, but in Costa Rica, where I come from, if you take 600 and you divide it by 40, you get 15. Is it the same in Hong Kong? Okay, good. So here's our problem. If you remember those two numbers, okay, 600 gigatons left, 40 gigatons being put up, more or less 40, okay? So scientists in the room will say, no, it's not exactly 40. I got it. But let's just have simple numbers, okay? 40 gigatons going up into the atmosphere. I think we can understand that we cannot, as a society, go from 40 gigatons per year to 0 overnight. It's not like you can emit for the next 15 years 40 gigatons, and then until the 31st of December of that year, and then on January 1 of the year after that say, guess what, we're at 0 now for the rest of the human experience. That just doesn't happen, right? We have to have a organized, gradual descent so that the global economy can actually transform itself and transition in an orderly fashion that is good for the economy, that is good for people, and that is good for the planet. So what that means is that we cannot continue the 40 gigatons per year, and that we actually have to reach a peak of our emissions and begin a gradual but very, very clear descent. Now you ask, so what is that point? That point, my friends, is 2020. So by 2020, which is 3.5 years from now, by 2020, we have to have reached the inflection point of greenhouse gases to the highest point and begin to come down. That is only 3 years from now. So my dear friends, here's my invitation to all of you today. Swallow the alarm clock. Swallow the alarm clock because we only have 3 years to make sure that we have the policies and measures in place, the capital flowing, and the technologies all aligned so that we begin our orderly transition that is not going to affect the strength and the stability of the global economy. Within that context, and here we are in the world's Built Environment Conference, within that context, cities. Because as we explained yesterday, and as we just had a brilliant presentation from Minister Wong, cities are really where this is all at. Cities are really where we already have, in 2020, we will have 4.3 billion people, not million, billion people living in cities, and by 2050, we're gonna have almost 7 billion. 7 billion in cities. And those people will, of course, be using electricity, they will be transporting themselves, and they will be using buildings. And therein, in electricity generation and consumption, in transportation, and in where we work and live, that is where the energy is going to go, and that is where we really need to focus so that we can begin our orderly descent of emissions. So, my invitation for all of you is not only that you swallow the alarm clock today, sorry about if that gives you indigestion after breakfast, not only that you swallow the alarm clock today, but that you really begin to plan for the next World Sustainable Built Environment Conference in 2020. Isn't that absolutely fortuitous? You will be getting together again 3 years from now for the next of these conferences, exactly in the year in which we must be able to begin our descent. So having had a personal conversation with the organizers of the 2020 conference, I would like to publicly make an invitation to all of you that you come to the 2020 conference not with incremental plans, because those are on the table, and I thank all of you for that, but actually for exponential plans, because that's what it's going to take. I would challenge that the 2020 conference be a conference at which every single person comes up and says, here is what we're doing to decarbonize the built environment. Decarbonize is different than reducing emissions. We have been reducing emissions for quite a few years, and sadly, it hasn't been enough. Why? Because we didn't do it quickly enough. Had we reached the Paris Agreement 10 years ago, we wouldn't be in this situation. But the fact is that the alarm clock is ringing, that the time limit is in front of our face, and we have to actually up our efforts. So 2020 Built Environment Conference should be about not just how we're reducing emissions in the built environment, but about our very concrete plans about how we're going to get the world's built environment, in particular in Asia. We've already heard that yesterday in repeated presentations, in particular in Asia, but not only, not just to reduce emissions, but to decarbonize. Fortunately, we are no longer in the world of incrementalism, because if you look at the reality of the digital revolution, if you look at the reality of artificial intelligence, if you look at the reality of big data, you know that we are in a world of exponential possibilities. And certainly if you look at the world of renewable energy. So my friends, we have everything that it takes. What the one piece that is still missing is our individual will, our focus to do it, because I have no doubt that we have every single necessary input and material to do this. But we have to give ourselves that challenge and say, we're going to do this. And we have to do it, because none of us want to stand in front of our children and say, you know what, we knew the mess that we were in, but actually, we were just doing things incrementally. We were just, trying to do little bits. No, it's not about doing incremental. Actually, sadly, but perhaps quite excitingly, this is now about exponential progress. This is about not doing the best that we can. This is about doing everything that we must. Thank you.
Well, the job of booking speakers has just gotten easier for the 2020 conference organizers. I wish that everyone could hear such a clear and convincing message. And speaking of Washington, our next speaker, Ms. Jennifer LAYKE, lives in Washington, and she is the Director of Global Energy Program at the World Resources Institute. Jennifer leads WRI's work globally on energy efficiency, on renewable energy, and on energy access. From 2014 to 2016, Jennifer's work focused on scaling up the Building Efficiency Accelerator, working with a number of cities around the world, supporting new policies, projects, and tracking their progress under the Sustainable Energy for All initiative on energy efficiency. Ms. LAYKE.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you to the two excellent plenary speeches we've heard before. I'd like to pick up with where we've left off, and Christiana, thank you for giving us that very important call to action on the timing of our challenge today. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what we're doing at World Resources Institute and what we're doing with cities around the world to make that agenda a reality. And those of you who don't know World Resources Institute, we're a global research organization turning ideas into action at the intersection of the environment and human development. Our goals are to be able to provide the solutions and bring those solutions to those who can act and take these agendas forward in the time frame that is required. I'm going to talk a little bit specifically today about cities. So I spent 2.5 years working on the urban agenda within our cities program. The cities program is not the program I currently lead, which is our energy program, but we work very closely together because this is an agenda that must intersect, and intersect in ways that will be unprecedented for cities. And let me tell you a minute why. Cities have been the recipients of energy that is generally planned at a national level, implemented through utilities, which are not in the control of city officials for the most part. Now, there are municipal energy companies, there are citizens and engagements that happen with utilities, but generally these tend to be national plans. So in thinking about the agenda that we have to bring to cities, we have to take back the energy agenda and provide those solutions that can get us the low carbon development pathway that Christiana described. So World Resources Institute is working in that space. We have over 220 staff that work on cities in 8 countries around the world. And our partnerships, and all of our work is done in partnerships with local institutions, are focused on those solutions. We've heard about the challenge and the scale that needs to be achieved and how quickly we are building our cities to lock in the high carbon trajectories of the past. So what do we need to do? 3 things. 1, we need to very carefully focus on the mobility services. The energy in our transportation systems is a lock-in effect. Our roads, our cities are designed for cars rather than for people today. Our buildings are designed not with the ability for those buildings to be the most productive investments, but for them to be the lowest first cost investments. And all of you work with us in trying to help shift the equation to value the built environment in a way that can deliver the maximum value over time. And it's not just the energy agenda that cities need to focus on. It's because of the energy use in cities that we have some of the biggest and most difficult impacts on our residents. So you can say to a mayor, you need to own this energy agenda, but what they really care about is the impact on the people in the city. We heard this already in the case of Hong Kong, how important that focus on air quality is, on the health of residents, on the productivity of residents. That's what a city cares about. It cares about its people, because for every life lost, those health impacts are real costs to cities. So how do we make this local? We need to improve the health of residents, their productivity, and we need to make these types of impacts connected in residents' minds, because otherwise this agenda doesn't have legs. We have a commission that WRI has been honored to support, the Global Commission for the Economy and Climate, and its findings resonate here. We have a compact, connected, coordinated infrastructure and governance challenge. That's what we're talking about. If we do these things well, we reduce the amount of investment that's required because we're thinking in smart new ways. Our Building Efficiency Initiative has tried to build those very types of approaches. The private sector and the public sector need to work together in ways that have been unprecedented, in partnerships to bring investment into the built environment and deliver the avoided lock-in. We have a publication we put out a year ago called 8 Actions for Urban Leaders. Again, focused on what are the opportunities to bring urban leaders forward with a set of straightforward solutions that can accelerate their response in the energy efficiency space. That includes bringing in new finance models building data and information systems that don't exist today. Very few cities have an understanding of what their built environment looks like in terms of an inventory of that environment. They have very little information about the energy consumption in those buildings. You all know these challenges. What you can't measure, you can't manage. And we need to build the ability for our management systems. And then connecting that data and information to our aspirations and our goals. High performance, net zero energy, net zero carbon. How do we do that? How do we think differently about those systems? District energy. We heard about the district energy solutions that are critical, and we highlight those in our publication. So at WRI, we bring this environmental challenge in as a governance challenge, in as a governance issue. We must think differently about the institutions and how the institutions build the agenda, engage on that agenda, and build out constituencies to represent the change that we need to create. Our change really focuses on awareness and capacity building and finance. Those three things, those three elements are the critical piece. You all have the technical solutions. We know the technologies are there, they're available, they're affordable today. We don't have the systems in place to deploy them as quickly as is needed. So we've tried to build this idea of actors who can take action, right? When we did an examination of the nationally determined contributions into the UNFCCC, there were actually fewer than a third of those that mentioned a built environment agenda. That's a national government issue. But if you talk to a city, cities care about what built environment they're putting in, and so connecting and linking that national, local agenda is critical. Doing so in the way that we think about the life cycle opportunities. And this is a depiction of the different types and different stages of actors who can build out solutions in different parts of that building's life cycle. So you can take a 20-year plan. You don't have to replace every roof that you know you're going to need to replace in a 3-year period. You know the capital reinvestment is going to occur. What are you putting in? Are you planning for it? Have you built that financing strategy? And what are you planning on doing in order to connect that into a new energy system or infrastructure? We're doing this with 28 cities today. 28 cities does not get us to scale. This has to be an agenda that is much more significant and scaled up. These 28 cities are selected by the very fact that they have a political will, that they have an open starting point to a public-private engagement, and that, in fact, they can represent a path forward. These are not, as you can see, the iconic cities of the world. These are the cities where the population is growing the fastest, where energy consumption is growing the fastest, and where they're going to be needing solutions quickly in order to avoid lock-in. So these 28 cities and the 35 different organizations that work with us around the world are working together in a public-private collaboration focused on a number of the basic things that could make a huge difference. Building codes, looking at above building code opportunities for certification of green buildings, looking at financing strategies, how to connect their work that they're doing to their public procurement strategies. Basic, simple items that can dramatically shift the trajectory that they're on. We were at the Sustainable Energy for All conference earlier this year, and we had 11 of our cities come and join us in New York. This initiative, this Building Efficiency Accelerator, as Kurt mentioned, is one of the energy efficiency accelerators under Sustainable Energy for All. And in bringing them together in New York to have a conversation about how do you finance these efforts and what does it take to get on the agenda of your mayor, we learned a couple things. One, we learned how critical it is that they can talk to each other. Two, they learned how critical it was to have a very clear and simple agenda. If you're going to do a public procurement program, what are the steps you need to put in order to ensure that you're building in the right types of energy efficiency technologies? Those are the kinds of things that cities need. We heard from Bogota about the fact that they actually had begun the process of working and engaging in a multi-stakeholder partnership that was going to radically transform the way that they look at their planning. So their master plans have changed as a result of this. That will have profound impact in a short and in a long term. But I want to acknowledge that the cities alone, these 28 cities, even if we scaled this to 1,000 cities, these cities alone need national government to step in, work with them as partners on the ground in order to be successful. Many of the utility programs that they could access, much of the planning that they need to do is linked and connected to those national agendas. We've been very pleased to be and honored to be part of the Global Alliance for Buildings and Construction, which has for the first time brought this agenda forward in the UNFCCC process with a Buildings Day, devoted exclusively to being able to talk about the national level agendas and help to reinforce the messages with our climate colleagues. So I want to spend just my last minute here talking about an example of Mexico City. Mexico City was one of the first cities to sign up to be part of the accelerator platform on building energy efficiency. They came in, they said, we have a vast public building stock, and we don't have a building code in place. The national government has a code. We've never implemented it. We can't permit against it. We can't enforce it. How do we do that? It's not an exclusive or unusual story in many cities around the world. The second thing they said is, we actually recognize that retrofitting of public buildings is a good idea, but we haven't found out how we're going to do that. We don't have data and information on the public buildings in our city, and so we began a process. We built out a local stakeholder group to help bring in opinions, information, ideas to the city. We built out a program that would allow them to adapt and adopt the national building codes into a local implementation strategy. And at the end of this, they announced when we were at the Sustainable Energy for All Forum that not only were they going to retrofit the 4 buildings they'd audited, they were actually going to move to create an entire new energy office, and that they were going to move forward with 30% of the public buildings in Mexico City. This is a dramatic shift from where they were when they signed up in 2014. And what it took was focus. And what it took was a process that didn't require that they were experts. Most cities don't have building experts on staff. They have a public works department that covers a lot of different topics. So how do you bring expertise to them in a way that's meaningful, in an engagement that's localized, and that's supportive of their goals and gets them started? Not because the first goal is going to be where they need to end up, but the first goal is what gets them started and empowers them to continue to build a vision of where they're going. And in working with you all and with many cities and national governments around the world, we can take this agenda to scale, but it requires that we build a community, that we build a movement, and we work together. So thank you very much for inviting me here, and I look forward to working with you all.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. As you've heard over the last couple of days, one of the main drivers for energy demand and one of the issues that affects sustainability in communities is rapid urbanization and the need for housing. UN Habitat helps to identify opportunities for sustainable urbanization and works with cities and with communities. Our next speaker is Mr. Gregor HERDA, Regional Housing Advisor with UN Habitat. He's an urban planner and has been coordinating the sustainable housing portfolio of UN Habitat since 2014, including the activities of the Global Network for Sustainable Housing. Gregor?
Good morning. So today I would like to make an old point about using a new example. The old point is about data and public procurement, and the new example is a new housing program which was launched the year after the last International World Sustainable Built Environment Conference in India, which is where I'm currently based. India has often been described as a rapidly urbanizing country. If you compare this, obviously, to the meteoric rise of China's urbanization in the 90s and early 2000s, you can see that it is actually fairly gradual. In terms of absolute numbers, though, you can see that this is quite the challenge indeed, with about 700 million people expected to live in urban India by 2041. A lot of this change is obviously going to occur in the mega cities of Bangalore, Mumbai, Chennai, Delhi, but also the third-tier cities. So very similar to China's urbanization, where a lot of the urban growth is happening in second-tier and third-tier cities. Now, that obviously also means that we have a huge challenge to provide housing for urban residents. This is a graph from a project that is funded by the 10-year framework of program, together with UN Habitat, the Oxford Brookes University, the Energy and Resource Institute, and Development Alternatives. And you can see on this graph that most of this housing need is in the low to very low income segment. Yeah. Now, in order to meet this challenge, the government in 2015 decided to launch an ambitious housing program, building 20 million units until 2022. These units are supposed to be affordable, code compliant, to be delivered in different geoclimatic zones, but also to give due consideration, that is the phrase used in the guidelines, of the energy concerns of the building industry. Now, the government basically sat down and looked at what are the existing construction technologies, and are they up to the task? If not, what are possible alternatives? And what we are, as part of this project currently are doing, is also adding this question, what could be the environmental impacts? There's also things to consider. For instance, depletion of raw materials. The deposits of limestone and sand are depleting, as are topsoils, for instance, for clay brick production. We also have a view of the conventional construction sector that is associated with air pollution and untimely delivery of projects. And you have this sense of urgency and need, requiring speedy delivery, but still adhering to quality. Now, as an additional bit of background information for you, one of the technologies or groups of technologies which are currently being looked at and strongly supported by the government is prefabrication. So everything from light gauge steel structures to precast concrete to EPS sandwich panels. Now, for this presentation, I did somewhat of a back-of-the-envelope calculation on what could be possible impacts, and I used a research collaboration UN Habitat is currently engaging in with the University of Melbourne, using Dr. Andre Stefan's energy metric, which is quite a powerful tool in that it is not only able to model the life cycle embodied energy of the top structure, but also adjoining infrastructure, water resource of the use of the occupants, as well as the transport requirements, and is able to model changes in that behavior over time. So for this back-of-the-envelope calculation, I basically excluded the transport requirements and only looked at embodied and operational energy. So what we did is basically imagining what would happen if we built a simple ground plus 3 apartment block using either clay brick or EPS or precast concrete or hollow concrete over a 50-year lifespan. That gives you sort of this breakdown. Obviously, the reason EPS is doing well because the model assumes lower operational energy because of its low U value. So what now would happen if we build 10 million of these units? Yeah? So 10 million units, basically half of what the program is supposed to build, 40 square meter units over 50 years. And we sort of assume a blanket carbon conversion factor of 60 kg of CO2 equivalent per gigajoule. The breakdown that you get there looks like this, with a difference between the worst and the best scenario of 0.3 gigatons. Now, how much is 0.3 gigatons? That is obviously a huge number, and it's very difficult to put into perspective. So what I would like to use as an analogy is basically the total output of the Indian economy, using the 2016 biannual review submitted to the UNFCCC. And according to this, 0.3 gigatons equals to shutting down the Indian economy for 51 days, which is quite a good target to go for. Obviously, there's an issue with this figure in that it is widely fictional. Widely fictional not only because we didn't accommodate for geoclimatic zones, etc., but also because life cycle embodied energy data for a lot of the building products is still not there. Also, carbon conversion factors for different building products are not really comparable or are not there at all, especially for the newer technologies which are currently being considered not only by the Indian government but by governments in the global south all over. So vast, significant policy decisions are currently made in a very information-poor environment, and this is a huge issue. Obviously, energy and carbon is not the only factor when you talk about housing. One should also consider the design flexibility of the building, the cultural acceptance, and also what will be the impacts on the labor market. Yeah? Obviously, in a country with a vast need for low-skilled labor, using a high-skilled labor technology such as prefab may have significant consequences. Now, I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation that this is an old point, and I went back into the archives to a time when I just graduated from primary school, and found, for instance, a commitment in the Agenda 21 on Sustainable Construction, which called for databases on the life cycle properties of building products. And going back even further to 1996, in the Habitat Agenda, we find a similar call to action. So I hope that with the momentum and drive that is exhibited here at this conference, we are able to raise the resources necessary to close these data gaps in order to make real evidence-based policy making happen. Lastly, I would like to look forward a bit. The SDGs were just mentioned to next week, where we will have the opportunity to discuss one of the SDG targets, 11.C, which deals with sustainable buildings in least developed countries and how to construct and retrofit them. So next Friday, if you have time, we will have the opportunity to discuss the methodology, to see how do we measure this target and who's going to do it. Alternatively, we also have the opportunity to propose an alternative wording which will take effect in 2019. So it is an online expert group meeting. You can find the connection details on eventbrite.com, and if you have time, you can join it from the comfort of your own home or the discomfort of your office. So I hope that many of you will be able to make it, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Gregor. A number of our speakers have mentioned data and information and the need for accurate data to inform policymaking. Our next speaker comes to us from Paris at the International Energy Agency, where he's the Energy Technology Policy Building Sector Lead. And he leads the analysis of the building sector and contributes to IEA's efforts to better understand the implications for a low-carbon economy. He's also one of the authors of the Global Alliance for Buildings and Construction Global Status Report. The first one of those was launched in 2016 following the launch of the alliance at COP21, and there will be another global status report in 2017. It's essentially a snapshot of where the building sector is and helps to assess the pathways going forward, what the building sector needs to do. So John is a critical partner in that effort, and I'd like to welcome him up to the stage.
Well, good morning, everyone, and it's very good to be here with you. As Kurt mentioned, we are working with UN Environment and several other partners here as part of the Global Alliance on Buildings and Construction to produce an annual status report looking at the building sector. It's also a lot of the work that my team does at the IEA, looking at where the building sector stands in terms of energy technology and policy. And I think the bad news here is that the building sector is probably the least performing with respect to clean energy technology. But at the same time, perhaps on a very positive note, is also the sector that has the most potential in terms of supporting decarbonization of the global energy economy. So to start, I just wanted to give you a very brief introduction, since it's being launched as we speak at the Clean Energy Ministerial in Beijing, what is happening at the IEA in terms of energy technology perspectives. For those of you who are not familiar with this, we launch every year a report that looks at two things. One, tracking of clean energy progress, and two, energy technology perspectives, essentially looking out now to 2060 at the energy technology and policy potentials for meeting targets with respect to energy efficiency and decarbonization of the energy economy. This year is perhaps a little specific, and I won't go into detail since it's being launched by our executive director now, but we have a new scenario. For the last 10 years, we have looked at a 2 degrees Celsius trajectory for the global energy economy. And this year, we have a second scenario that is coming out of the Paris Agreement, looking at what a below 2 degree trajectory would look like between now and 2100. I'm not going to give you the specifics of what the actual temperature target is, since that's not the IEA's core mandate, but we essentially looked at something that would be between 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees. And in the building sector, this is actually quite interesting and opportunistic, since the building sector, as many of the previous speakers have mentioned, is highly dependent on electricity production. Globally, it's about 55% of electricity demand. And energy efficiency is highly untapped in the building sector, which means that clean energy technology and energy efficiency in the building sector actually could drastically support decarbonization of the power sector, and at the same time also provide much greater flexibility within the energy sector, as well as providing real opportunities for more resilient and flexible energy supply. So to give a quick start, I think Jennifer mentioned that it's very hard to know where you should go without knowing where you are today. And the big part of the work that we do at the IEA is understanding and tracking of energy technology and policy. And I think the bad news here is that the building sector is not on track at all with respect to 2 degree or below 2 degree targets. And as you can see here on the top, this is largely due to the built environment. So we know that globally, less than 1/3 of buildings actually are covered by mandatory energy building codes. It's a very similar number for equipment and appliances in buildings. Only about 1/3 actually fall under mandatory energy performance standards. And that we're not at all in line with long-term trajectories in terms of where we should be in terms of energy technology progress. There is, however, at least some very positive light coming out of this, especially with regards to appliances and lighting. Now, this is actually only a very small portion of the building energy load globally, where heating and cooling, of course, are the largest energy consumers in the building sector. But perhaps on a positive note, showing the real potential for buildings, we have seen over the last 3 years, for example, light-emitting diodes, so LED lighting technology, go from essentially 0 to about 30% of the market in about 4 years. So this really shows the potential for rapid deployment of clean energy technologies that, as Jennifer mentioned, generally speaking, are cost-effective. The problem there is the hurdle of the upfront cost. But in terms of life cycle costs, most of them are in fact negative. They deliver high quality services using much less energy, much less emissions in terms of the relationship between either direct or indirect emissions coming from the building sector, but we're not moving fast enough. So, to give you an idea of where we are in terms of where we've come from, which is, again, a lot of the work we do at the IEA looking at the building sector, the very negative news here is that, in fact, the building sector, despite its enormous growth, especially in rapidly emerging economies, has not really changed that much in terms of fuel consumption or energy performance. And what you can see here in these dots is that the change in floor area is much faster than the energy performance improvement in the building sector, which essentially means that the building sector continues to grow in terms of energy demand. And again, because the building sector consumes more than half of global electricity production, and because most of the world's energy production for electricity is using fossil fuels, this is a big problem because the building sector continues to produce more and more direct and indirect emissions, consuming globally more than a third of final energy, and in terms of emissions, producing about a third of the world's energy-related CO2 emissions. So a lot of work to be done here. I think looking forward, where this becomes perhaps most challenging, but also, again, a major opportunity, is that we see significant growth in building additions, obviously in developing countries, and over the next 20 years, perhaps most importantly in rapidly emerging economies, and that the share of those additions becomes perhaps extremely frightening when thinking about the challenge that lays before us. As Christiana mentioned, we have a very short closing window of opportunity. This is not only in terms of emissions, but also the building sector. What you're seeing here, in fact, are the additions of building floor area that we see happening to 2060. So essentially, the next 40 years of what we think will happen in the building sector. What you're seeing on the right axis here in terms of these dots is the share of those additions that will be built before 2035. And as you can see that for practically all of the regions here, more than half of the building floor area additions will be built over the next 20 years. And since, typically speaking, building additions are 50, 75, even 100-year lifetimes, this means that we have the huge potential, the catastrophic potential of locking in very inefficient buildings. And that if we really want to make a difference, especially because these are long-lived assets, we drastically need to ramp up energy performance of building construction if we want to be in line with 2-degree targets. If we don't, it will be much more expensive, much more difficult, and certainly much more challenging from a social perspective to actually meet those targets by having to do very expensive renovations of those buildings in the future. The other key piece here is that more than 80% of those additions will come from the global south, so developing countries, where practically all of those additions happen in countries that do not currently have in place mandatory energy codes for the buildings, for the entire building stock of what will be constructed over the next 20 years. So there's significant work to be done here in terms of making sure that where buildings are going to be built in the coming decades, we put in place and enforce building energy codes. So that's where we stand. How do we go forward with a more sustainable building stock? How do we move from very typical G, E, and F-type buildings, for those of you who are familiar with different building energy rating schemes, to A and Energy Plus type buildings in the future? If you look here, these are, again, our IEA outlooks for the building sector, looking at what you see here on the left of a reference technology scenario. So this is essentially business as usual, moving towards 2 degrees or below 2 degrees in terms of the targets for the building sector. And a couple of things need to happen. First, with regards to building construction, we need to build much more efficient buildings, much higher performance buildings, near zero energy buildings, zero energy buildings, energy positive buildings. And at the same time, we also need to change what is happening within buildings. So much more efficient equipment, higher performance lighting and cooling, for example, but also changing the supply of where the energy comes from, particularly as you can see here in the scenario on the right, going from an economy that is largely speaking driven by fossil fuels to one that is very much driven by renewables and clean electricity for the building sector. Now, what does this mean in terms of the emissions trajectory? In a normal 2-degree scenario, this means that we get very close to zero emissions in the building sector. And again, this year we looked at what this would need to be if we wanted to be in line with a below 2-degree trajectory, which essentially means that when taking into account carbon capture and storage, that we would go negative in terms of the emissions by 2060. Now, the bottom wedge here that you're seeing is in fact coming from the power sector. Buildings in theory could actually put in, I suppose, carbon capture and storage, but this is unlikely. But what's perhaps most important here, if you look at the top wedges, is that the direct emissions, so the hashed portions of the top wedges, are essentially the emissions reductions coming from the building sector by reducing fossil fuel consumption. The rest is all energy efficiency. And what's perhaps most critical here, as I mentioned, is there is a real opportunity for buildings to support decarbonization of the energy sector. More than half of the emissions reductions coming from the building sector are in fact due to energy efficiency, which supports decarbonization of the power sector. In other words, if you had to meet those emissions reductions without energy efficiency in buildings, you would need a heck of a lot more carbon capture and store in the power sector. You would have to somehow make up for the lack of energy efficiency in buildings by decarbonizing power. So there's a real opportunity here, and I think what's perhaps most interesting is that we know those technologies exist and they are cost effective. So, taking a step back and thinking about what happens over the next decade, 2 decades in terms of building construction. We started looking, because again, we think this is a critical priority for the building sector, at what would happen in terms of changes in floor area. I think perhaps most interesting, if you go all the way to the right here and look at our reference technology scenario, and then what we see as the clean energy technology pathways for the building sector, is that we would essentially have to double the number of near zero energy buildings and building deep energy renovations in buildings by 2060. At the same time, we would also have to double the energy performance of the global building stock. Now, this is not impossible, but it certainly would be a challenge that would require a drastic change in the way we address the building sector, particularly in terms of building policy and building construction, and at the same time how we finance clean energy technology for the building sector globally. If we don't do that, and this is perhaps a message of warning, what is likely to happen, in fact, is that we would consume significantly more energy for heating and cooling in buildings. So what you're seeing here is a 10-year delay. Okay, this is not 40 years of progress. This is essentially saying that if for the next 10 years we continue to be slow in building energy performance, what is likely to happen? And essentially it means that we consume something like 125 exajoules of additional energy in the building sector. So for those of you who are not familiar with energy speak, 125 exajoules is equivalent to all of the energy consumed by the global building sector last year. Okay? That is because of a 10-year delay in improving building energy performance. It's huge. Okay? Now, at the same time, we also need to change. So we often talk about building energy codes. We need to think drastically about how to change what we actually put into buildings. Okay? Very often today what we see is that we have building codes, maybe we even have near zero energy buildings, and then because installers are familiar with certain products, they typically put in gas boilers, they put in CFL for lighting, maybe if they're familiar they put in LED lighting, they put in air conditioning units that are not high performance. Why? Because they're familiar with them, they're comfortable with them, because the manufacturers provide guarantees for those equipment. What we need to do, if you shift to the right again here, is drastically shift to extremely energy efficient, high performance equipment in buildings, where in this example here, it means shifting from fossil fuels, which are more than 60% of the equipment in buildings today, to high performance technologies like heat pumps, for example, district energy systems that was mentioned earlier, solar thermal technologies for buildings, and get off of those fossil fuels to decarbonize the global building stock. At the same time, we also need to drastically improve the performance of buildings. And I think, as was mentioned by our first speaker, looking at the very hot climate here in Hong Kong, cooling is very rapidly growing. In fact, it is the fastest growing end use in the building sector. In some countries, it is growing as much as 10% per year. At the same time, if we look at what is actually being sold in markets, the reality is that despite the fact that we have extremely efficient technologies available on practically all markets, the global average, as you can see here in terms of performance, is very similar, and it's underperforming. We need to do a job of shifting from typical, so coefficients of performance here of 2 with most cooling equipment, to what is available of 4, 5, and 6, or even better. We need a major market push to get off of inefficient technologies and to move to high-performance, energy-efficient technology solutions. So, that's where we should be going. How do we get there? I don't want to go through these in details, especially since I know we have several speakers left, but you're familiar with these messages. We need to push the market forward. We need to put in place energy performance standards for buildings construction, buildings renovation, buildings equipment, and force the market to move to more efficient solutions, especially since we know that those solutions are cost effective. This is difficult, but we know we can do it. We at the same time need to put in place the financing that makes it available so that the building sector can actually meet those objectives. And at the same time, we need to pull forward much more efficient technologies. So we hear very often in the energy technology realm a need for innovation in the building sector. In fact, there's a new challenge, Mission Innovation, that is looking at affordable heating and cooling across the G20 countries. And one of the critical pieces here will be to say, how do we actually bring about much more efficient technology solutions for the building sector? And the last piece is that, of course, you need a policy framework to do this. And again, I won't go through these in details, but we have great examples across the world, whether it be national policies, local policies, regional policies, or even innovative programs that are being led by the private sector that show that this is possible. But we need a call for action. We need to continue to work with stakeholders in the building sector to say, we're not going to put up with inefficient building construction and equipment. We want these products, and start pushing the markets forward. So with that, I thank you very much for your time, and very happy to discuss with you during the conferences.
Thank you very much, John. Between John's presentation on pathways and how to go forward and Christiana's message that we cannot focus on incremental improvements, you have something to think about over the coffee break. We have about 13 and a half minutes for a coffee break. You'll be back here at 10:45. And we have 2 more speakers, and then we'll have a panel discussion. So please, if you could be prompt at 10:45. To begin this second part of the Sustainable Development and Climate Change session, I'm going to turn the podium over to Mr. Nils Larsen. He's been introduced a number of times over the course of the last day and a half. So he will introduce to you a survey of GHG mitigation measures. Mr. Larsen.
Thank you, Kurt. For those of you who don't know, I'm Executive Director of WSBE and also the representative of the SBE partnership, which runs the conference series. And Christiana FIGUERES was referring to the start of the series decades ago. Ray Cole and I launched one of the first ones in BC in 1998. And I just wanted to add to your your important comments about the 2020 significance that don't forget 2019. We're going to have national events, hopefully about a dozen of them in different countries, and they are all linked forward to 2020. So if we could get some really aggressive proposals on the table in 2019, they can be polished and perfected in time for 2020. Okay, I had 6 minutes. I think I'm down to 4 now, but that's all right. And about the 2019, we have 5 expressions of interest already, but they're mainly from Europe, so we're hoping to get some from Asia. Because also, as Christiana FIGUERES pointed out, Asia is hugely important, and well, I don't need to say that around here. So let's get some expressions of interest in from Asia. This is a story which is about a survey, and we wanted to have a survey of what practitioners, researchers, architects, designers, contractors, building operators think are the most effective ways of reducing greenhouse gases rapidly in their regions. And that's quite different from the kind of top-down policy-led initiatives that exist. I unfortunately have to tell you that although our small pilot in 2015 was very successful, had a very high response rate of the small numbers sent out, 150 or something, we launched the web-based one recently, and starting beginning of this year, we've had a very poor response rate to that one. We've got to figure out why and relaunch it. My own personal idea is that it's the business, when you go on a survey, fill in this page, next, fill in this page, next, and you don't know where you are. Whereas the Excel one, you can see where you are. So hopefully we can get some participation from the audience here who are interested, if I can find out who you are, and to help us figure out how to make it work better when we relaunch it at the end of the summer. But the concept, we believe, is quite good, and the kind of contents we have include general actions ranging from tax to should we have demonstrations, etc., education, and so on. You can see here it's a broad range, but general actions. And then we get into urban area level actions. And again, it's fairly general, but it allows also the respondents to add notes and comments to their what they think are important measures. And to buildings and construction, and there's 2 pages of these here. And these are all things I think that most of you are familiar with, ranging from high-performance equipment to building regulations. So we need all this kind of stuff, but I think it is important to get the bottom-up view of what works, to complement the top-down initiatives that come from research organizations and so on. So retrofits, etc. You can get some of this from. We'll give you if you go to our booth 27, 28. We'll give you references where you can find the details. And the question is, it was launched in English and French. We want to do it in several languages, but we have to get it so that people want to respond to it. Was the thing too long? Have there been too many surveys? We don't know, but we'll work hard to get the answer, and thank you. 0.
Thank you very much, Nils. Our next speaker, well, just before I introduce our next speaker, Christiana mentioned the Sustainable Development Goals. They've been mentioned a number of times today and some yesterday. SDG number 12 is on responsible consumption and production. And as many of you know, there is what's known as the 10-year framework of programs on sustainable consumption and production. There are a number of programs within that overall framework. One of them is on sustainable buildings and construction. And the coordinator of that program is seconded from the government of Finland, Mr. Pekka Huvila, who will introduce that program.
Thank you for the introduction and for the invitation. A couple of new acronyms here. In addition to GB, SB, SBE, we are talking about SBC now, Sustainability and Construction. And this presentation tries to provide a platform for implementing the action that Christiana FIGUERES was asking for in her opening speech. So this 10-year framework of programs is a global action for sustainable consumption and production consisting of 6 programs. And the whole instrument started something like 5 years ago. It will be run for 10 years. And buildings and construction is one of those 6. We have been doing this program for 2 years now and see it very well contributing to also the other programs, because the tourism is very much looking for building technologies in the hotel development, consumer information. Buildings, of course, are part of that, as well as public procurement and lifestyle that let's say, relate with how people are operating the buildings and the built environment. Food system is the other one that is still completing this set. And that program was preceded by quite wide consultation of different governments, business organizations, civil society, academia, and intergovernmental organizations. And like said, Ministry of the Environment from Finland is leading this program, and we have RMIT University from Australia as our co-lead, as well as UN Environment. And then we have this multi-stakeholder advisory committee consisting of same, let's say, types of organizations as were consulting it before starting. And actually we report both to this MAC committee, as we call it, that is like supervising our work. In addition to that, we report to the 10YP board and also to high-level political forum. So this is like the organizational part of our program. And we have organized our work into 4 horizontal work streams, where the enabling frameworks look at the policy aspects. Then we have housing as the only like sector-based theme there. We look at the supply chain as a whole, and then this climate impact, both mitigation to and also resilience to climate change. And then as a cross-cutting theme, we look at knowledge sharing, outreach, and awareness raising. And a bit like added to the previous speakers, where it was very much emphasizing on energy, for us we look at the sustainability as a whole. We look at affordability, we look at the social aspect, job creation, and also aspects other than directly, let's say, climate related. And we work together in collaboration with the other programs, but then we can also have partners with whom we develop and implement these activities in the program. Looking at the thematic areas that are even a bit wider than those 4 horizontal streams, this is like mapping the topics our program covers. And now relating once again to those SDGs, which we find very relevant to our work. So we were present in the Paris Climate Conference in Paris, where we launched our first trust fund call. We were also present in the Habitat 3, where the new urban agenda was released, and also we are looking at how these sustainable development goals can be met. The human health, indoor, outdoor, that's clearly one of the topics that our program is addressing. We look at the resources, not only water or energy, but also looking at the capacity building on how people can be trained in order to implement and adopt these technologies and solutions, meeting with their physical environment. We look at the resource efficiency and also innovation, how we can support innovation in the built environment. And then I think this job creation for all genders, also to the youth, relates to this SDG 10. 11, clearly for cities where buildings are an important component. 12 was mentioned already, that 10YP is one of the topics on this material. Then we look at the climate, clearly also the land use, how that can be efficiently used, and networking is one of our means of implementing these targets. So we look at how we can collaborate with different stakeholders in order to deliver these objectives. Some examples of the project activities we are carrying out. We have used this trust fund, 10YP trust fund grant for some small projects. We have now 3 of them ongoing, 2 with whom we are now signing the contract at this time, and we have also shortlisted 7 potential ones that we are ready to start as soon as we can ensure the funding for those. So we have a organization we can monitor, we can manage, they are quality assured those programs, and they are for emerging markets. So the applicant needed to be based in the developing countries, so emerging economies, and to be not-for-profit organization. Then the other type of project we are running is those flagships, which are larger scale projects, and they are like initiated by our our team can be MAC members or partners, and then they are endorsed by this MAC committee, as mentioned. But for that, we don't have our own budget, so we have to discuss their start together with donors. So funding is sought from outside, and we have a couple of those now submitted to different calls, and they are under discussion with donors, but we have not started those yet. But then we are also trying to disseminate information about the other project activities we are, let's say, developing together with our partners. And some examples of those, like in Colombia, we are looking at, in Abura Valley, in the Medellin region, actually, with the help of our funding, the local municipality was able to build a team together with 10 other municipalities to build capacity for certain buildings. And that also includes industrial players. There's utility companies and waste management companies with whom they are together trying to look at how this sustainable building could be implemented in that wider region across the municipalities and also scaled up and replicated. The idea, or let's say the defining criteria in our project selection was precisely this scalability and replicability. We want to get out of this standalone project that will dry out after the funding is finished. The other one is called the Sherpa tool, and that's for that we see the tool that has been developed already. Actually, it should be coming public later this month, and we can disseminate the information where you can download it for free, and that's for sustainable housing. We see that as a tool that can be used both for implementing and monitoring this new urban agenda, but primarily it's for helping, giving guidance for target setting in sustainable, affordable housing development. In addition to Kenya's slum upgrading program, NGOs from Burkina Faso and Architects Sans Frontières from Nepal, that's already implemented now in Nicaragua also. And with the university in Grenoble, Crater, they have 22 postmaster students that are at the same time testing it in 12 developing countries. So we have quite wide test bench in the developing countries, emerging economies at present for that. The third one that is now running, it's about how to mainstream sustainable social housing. Gregor HERDA already mentioned that because UN Habitat is leading that exercise. And that is, among others, developing a decision support tool for housing and trying to gather this hard data, building some sort of building materials and technology index that could be exploited, because the intention is that after the first case that will be brought to other regions in India. The other component of the program is its outreach. Last year we were giving something like 500 training days and reaching more than 3,000 people in 60 events, and we tried to be present in the most important events like this one in order to extend our networks and also find new partners with whom we can discuss this implementation of this, let's say, research or other ideas into practice. And the picture is from Quito in Urban Agenda, where our Ministry of Environment was opening the session. Unfortunately, the room wasn't bigger than that. There were crowds, let's say, queuing outside. Then a bit doing this sort of assessment. Actually, the whole 10YFP will be evaluated next year because the 5-year term will finish by the end of this year. And in this resource mobilization has been the biggest challenge for us out of the project that we find good, but where we don't have funding yet, and how to engage better our network in preparing those good proposals and communicate those to donors. And maybe with the help of the other programs, we can build, let's say, bigger projects that can also have bigger impacts. And for next steps, I have to close in a couple of seconds actually to stick to the schedule. We look at this replication, scaling up the project activities, as well as building the knowledge base that can be shared through the clearinghouse that is provided for disseminating information. At the same time as this event here, we are hosting in Finland the first World Circular Economy Forum, where the whole 10YFP, but also International Resource Panel are attending. And there's actually, I think, yesterday at this time was a session just about the collective impact of 10YFP circular economy. And then we also developed, actually led by our team, this monitoring evaluation framework that is used to assess the impacts of the whole program. And to finish, I just invite you to be in contact with us, our program, or other 10YP program, so that we can see how the things could be brought into practice. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Pekka. I think Pekka emphasized the importance of international platforms and platforms for mainstreaming best practices and policies. But we also know that without the private sector engagement, that many of these public policies, many of these best practices will not be put into implementation. So our next speaker is Mr. Roland Hunziker. He's the Director of Sustainable Buildings and Cities, which is a pretty big portfolio for the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. He's based in Geneva, and he has been involved both in the 10YFP and the Global Alliance for Buildings and Construction, and is a longtime collaborator with UN Environment and a number of the platforms that we've heard about today. Roland?
Good morning. Thank you very much, Kurt, for having invited me to be with you today. I'm your last speaker, and at the same time, I'm kind of the private sector representative. So we've heard all about the challenges. Now, I hope you're not expecting from me to hear about all the solutions, but obviously, we need to work much more closely between the public and the private sector in addressing the challenges we've heard this morning. I will focus very much on buildings and cities and that need for collaboration. First, a couple of words about WBCSD, World Business Council for Sustainable Development. We're a global coalition of about 200 multinational companies, and we work together with our members on a transition to a sustainable world. We operate under what we call the Vision 2050, 9 billion people living well within the limits of the planet. And we want to accelerate the transition through sustainable business. So how can we make more sustainable businesses more successful? Through, obviously, improving the operations of the businesses themselves, but maybe even more importantly, working on the enabling frameworks and the markets and the market readiness for more sustainable products and services. And you'll hear a bit of that in the examples later on. Why we still mention the Vision 2050, it was developed in 2010, is because it predicted very, very accurately what would happen in the second decade of this century, the turbulent teens. And turbulent indeed they are. We have many overlaying challenges that we need to grapple with. And just early this year, we did for ourselves a little exercise looking at what are the mega trends that are facing us, our businesses, all of us as individuals. And that's just a very brief highlight. I won't spend too much time on this, but obviously climate change and its effects. Every year is getting hotter. Combined problems around our CO2 emissions going up, but also air pollution in cities going up. Demographic changes, we are getting older. At the same time, young populations increasingly lack the skills to keep up economic activities to support our older populations, so a huge challenge coming to us. And if we just go across, has a lot to do with the technology paradox. We can do more and more things with AI, technology supported, but that often challenges the very way in which we as humans are working and our economic base. The shifts in political and economic epicenters, more towards cities, more towards Asia, the South, Africa will grow. Consumption and values, we see growing middle class consuming more and more. At the same time, millennials in many of our countries are looking for new ways of living and new ways of aspirations. And we're currently doing some work on what is the good life 2.0. How do we change aspirations we all have from better, stronger, more to something different that doesn't put as much a strain on our resources. And not least, globalization and the difficult challenges that come with that. We're increasingly connected. However, in many societies, we're also looking for what's our identity and how do we go back to our base. And not least, these days remind us, terrorism today is the 4th most important risk according to the World Economic Forum, so clearly something that is coming up. So that's just to briefly situate again ourselves and obviously the operating environment for us as businesses. But we have 2 major milestones, and thank you, Christiana, for having given us the one on the right-hand side. The Paris Agreement as well as the SDGs are clearly mileposts out there that business is using and orienting its action towards. The Paris Agreement gives a very strong, long-term signal. It was lauded by business, and the SDGs are also used to measure business performance increasingly. We have developed an SDG hub, CEO guide for the SDGs to really also show to the businesses how we can gear up to deliver towards this agenda. Now, why should we in business focus on cities? This is where businesses have their resources, their markets, the people. So it's an important risk management to engage in cities and see how we can make them more sustainable. But it's also a huge opportunity for most businesses. And this is just a quote from the recent report of the Business and Sustainable Development Commission that has tried to quantify the business opportunities from actions in cities. So there's a huge agenda for business to engage in the built environment and in cities overall. We also believe that cities need more engagement with the private sector, access to business expertise, innovation and delivery, implementation capacity, and a much more integrated approach. And for that, we need new forms of collaboration, and we need new organizational and finance models. We have the classic public-private partnership models. We need more than that. We need a much more strategic engagement between business and the public sector. At WBCSD, we're working on a holistic way of addressing cities' challenges. We have, over the last couple of years, worked on a sustainable cities engagement model. So how can we, in our activities where we bring together groups of companies to work with city decision makers on their challenges, how can we frame that in a holistic way? And we help cities in setting their ambition and scope, have integrated priorities, and what's most important, align stakeholders and get businesses involved on that agenda. We do it through strategic city business engagement, from scoping to really aligning and getting the right stakeholders involved to overcoming market barriers and really driving towards implementation of these activities. There is a very large opportunity there for us to work much more together. I just wanted to give you a few examples of what we're currently doing. One of our projects is on zero-emission cities. Zero emissions is aspirational. So how can we help, and we've heard it this morning, get to transformational change within cities? One example is in Amsterdam, where we started working almost 2 years ago. And together with the city and a number of our companies, we identified one of the most energy-intensive districts in Amsterdam. And we said, can we transform this into a zero-emissions district? And we have created the stakeholder engagement in that district. You have a football stadium, a large hospital, you have several banks, it has a residential area. How do we organize that district for success? And we've come up with a model called Zo-Energy, Zuidoost Energy, for the name of that district. And we're currently working on a new organization and business model for that organization. It's driven by the city and a number of businesses to really drive energy projects, CO2 reduction projects in that area. So it's still in the making. We hope it really will really be successful. But this is the kind of partnerships we need to work on at the city level to really address this challenge. Another example is with Birmingham in the UK. We also started working, and the city said, we have several regeneration projects coming up in our city, and we would really like to develop a low-carbon development, but not only that. We're a biophilic city, so how can we integrate green infrastructure and also our agenda of social inclusion into this. So we've helped them with a zero-emission city framework at the planning level of master plan, to really address those different sustainability challenges. And we selected indicators where the city had to position itself on compliance, best practice, or really aspirational. Best practice is we can look around, we looked at several of our business partners and what is done elsewhere. Aspirational is where you try to go a step above that. And we're now in the situation to look at, is this financially feasible? How do the costs and benefits stack up of this development? So we're in a very interesting moment this year and next to see this through with the City of Birmingham. Another of our programs focuses on buildings, on energy efficiency in buildings. It's been driven by a group of our members for a number of years now. And also in the building sector, we believe in local action and having to bring together the fragmented value chain in driving that action. And we have developed a program of dedicated workshops that look at the barriers for energy efficiency from a market perspective and how those can be overcome through different actions around awareness, workforce capacity, finance, and policy. We've created in some cities what we call EEB platforms, and these are multi-stakeholder groups that drive an action plan forward that was created through those workshops. And we're involved with the Building Efficiency Accelerator as a private sector partner to see, I have 2 more minutes according to this, how we can implement this. And lastly, we do some work around mobility. Again, a group of our members over the last 3 years developed a comprehensive fact-based sustainable urban mobility planning tool. It's based on 19 indicators for sustainable mobility, which have been endorsed by the European Commission and will be tested in 50 European cities in the next 2 years. And this is connected with a solutions toolbox. So a city goes through a process of identifying its priorities, and it can then look at what are available solutions and enabling frameworks for that to be implemented. So what is next? This is more of a bit of an announcement of work we want to develop through the Global Alliance on Buildings and Construction, the GABC. We believe that for this sector to be able to truly pursue a decarbonization agenda, we need to work on sectoral targets. So yes, individual companies through the value chain, they can take their own targets, but they will never stack up. If you reduce the carbon emissions on a material, it may have a not so beneficial effect on the system itself. So we have to really look at these trade-offs. And so we have started engaging with the World Green Building Council and a number of other partners under the GABC to start such a conversation. It will take some time. Hopefully we can report back before 2020 on how this will help the sector move forward. So thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to the discussion afterwards.
Thank you, Roland. Let me introduce first for the panel discussion Ms. Christine Low. We heard from Mr. Wong, the Secretary of the Environment for Hong Kong SAR this morning. Ms. Christine Low is the Undersecretary for the Environment. She was, prior to that, the Chief Executive Officer of the nonprofit public policy think tank Civic Exchange. She spent nearly a decade as a politician. So we'll have an interesting dialogue, perhaps, with Ms. Low. So Ms. Low, if you would join us up here. Ms. Christiana FIGUERES, if you would join. Jennifer LAYKE. Gregor HERDA, Pekka Huavila, if you would come up. What I wanted to do is have a kind of a freewheeling discussion. Hopefully you won't all agree. Hopefully you'll argue some, because it's far more entertaining for the audience to have some disagreements and have kind of an active exchange rather than everyone just agree with each other and think everything's fine. So please, feel free to challenge each other, ask each other questions. But I'll start with a couple of questions. and an introduction. The lead up to the Paris Agreement successfully engaged many non-state actors, and Christiana, you were very much involved in the NAZCA platform, which was the non-state actor zone for climate action. It was not just member states talking, but it was an engagement process that really included the public sector, the private sector, NGOs, and others to establish collective platforms. One of those that was launched at COP21 is the Global Alliance for Buildings and Construction, and that was to accelerate the scale and pace of actions. First question is, does the engagement of non-state actors in any respect buffer against circumstances such as perhaps one state withdrawing from the Paris Accord? Can these actors step up and take on greater responsibilities? And what must happen for them to be empowered and enabled to do so? So Christiana, if you would start.
Okay. You know, I think there is a temptation to fall into what I would call a rather default simplistic thinking that this is either federal governments or non-state actors. That's not the case. The reason why for 6 years we worked very hard to open the space for non-state actors is because there was a very clear realization that this is a collaborative and cooperative effort, that each of these actors play a different but complementary role, and that it is the responsibility of federal governments to set the direction. So think about it as, you know, they are the captains on the ship, and they're sitting there with the GPS, and they go, this is the direction that we're moving in. But the federal governments are very rarely in the engine room, very rarely. It is actually everyone else who's in the engine room actually doing the hard work of moving forward. And so in the preparation for Paris, we thought, well, let's get everybody on to the same discussion. So, you know, to your rather discrete question about the current situation in the United States, the fact is that in any country, obviously an alignment from federal government to state government to city to corporate sector to civil society, a perfect alignment is what brings the maximum impact for the lowest cost. That would be the ideal, but that's not always the case. And so if a federal government steps out or, you know, doesn't support, or in some cases it's the government of the capital city that is not supportive, the point is that there's always someone who is not going to be perfectly aligned. That does not mean that that country or that economy is not moving forward. It just means they're not moving forward as efficiently as they otherwise could.
Okay. Christine, from the perspective of Hong Kong, how do you see that alignment between what happens in Hong Kong and the national objectives of national government?
Well, I think in Hong Kong, we are aligned with China's national perspective. China is continuing to work very hard on climate change issues. Now, Hong Kong is a very special part of China, one country, two systems. We don't have to, if we don't want to, follow national policy. But on climate change, we very much want to be a part of the national picture. So that's point number one. Number two is, in Hong Kong, actually, we were very inspired by the Paris Agreement. And what we sought to do in Hong Kong is how to then align ourselves, government, business, and civil society in a medium-sized city. And we're all sitting here right now. Now, one of the things that I think is very important, and I think it underlies a lot of what everybody said today, is, well, how do we do that alignment? Are we in the engine room? Who's in the engine room? Well, I think government has to take this on. So the Hong Kong government, we're very serious about it. And we need to go and preach the Paris Agreement, because the Paris Agreement is an international agreement, and our country signed on to it. So we've developed what we call the 4 Ts. I mean, how do we explain something so complicated like the Paris Agreement? First of all, to my colleagues, and many of them are sitting here today, right? So we've created a song. The song is called
Are you going to sing right now?
I'm going to sing, yes. I'm going to sing right now, okay? So if you don't remember anything I say, just remember the 4T song. So the song goes like this. Do 4 things, right? Number 1, have a target.
Well, where's the song?
The song, this is the song.
Okay.
This is the song.
I thought you were going to
Sing.
sing.
It's a no music song.
No fair, Christine. You have to add music to it.
Well, I'll put it to music next time.
Okay.
All right. So the first T, have a target. The second T, have a timeline. The third T, well, metrics, have the transparency. And the last T is let's do it all together. Now, these 4 ideas, this is how we have distilled the magic of the Paris Agreement. And we think it works, right? Because I've been preaching to my colleagues, I've been preaching to business in Hong Kong and to the community, and if they remember nothing else, they remember the 4T. So now we have to operationalize it. And operationalizing requires a lot of people in the engine room. So we're developing this process to do that. And I think it is possible, but it's hard work. And I think all the speakers this morning have really talked about how do you get it done? And you know, we know the data and so on, and actually collecting data is incredibly difficult. We haven't got all of it in Hong Kong. My colleagues who've been responsible, they've got lots of data, but how do you put it together? What are we not collecting? Do we know how to analyze it? Who do we work with amongst the professionals who can help us? You know, bringing everybody in the room. The last thing I want to say is, well, who are the owners and managers of our buildings? Well, the public sector has a lot of buildings, all kinds of buildings. The private commercial sector has a lot. The private non-commercial sector has a lot. So we need to bring all these people together gradually. And I think some of you were at the government house last night. This is the home of the chief executive. We borrowed his home, and we brought the leaders of all these organizations together, and we sang the song. So they remember. And we're kind of powering away. But you know, I think this is what cities need to do. This is what government needs to do. There's one thing that government has. It's a freebie that other people find it more difficult to obtain. And that's the power of convening. Mm-hmm. Now, we don't know everything. We can't actually mandate everything, but we can bring them together. So I think that's a very important start.
Jennifer, WRI is working in a number of cities. And at the city level, most politicians really campaign on platforms of public safety, economic development, and education. Those are kind of the 3 pillars of a political campaign. Where is sustainable development? Where is climate change in those pillars? Or does there need to be a 4th? Is it embedded, or does it need to be more visible somehow? And how do you influence politicians to promote it?
I want to make a couple of observations. You know, if we had talked about climate change and sustainable development to city officials a decade ago, there would have been a much more limited view of that agenda. And today, with the kinds of changes that we're seeing among the younger generation towards a shared economy, towards a vision that would be inclusiveness of these agenda items, it is a different conversation. I think that the lessons, however, around the need for social cohesion and inclusiveness cannot. In fact, if you look at where we are today, I think my mic just went off, there we go. The topic of energy efficiency, we still have communities that say we can't afford energy efficiency today. We have to get basic. In fact, the challenge we've got around this is that it has to be an agenda for all. And types of technologies, construction approaches, jobs needs to be on the table at all times. You can't tell a construction somehow that it needs to somehow think through a scenario in which the people aren't at the center. So we need those jobs, we need that training, we need that to be a part of the economic agenda. So the sustainability agenda must be grounded in how to deliver a better and more sustainable industrial base. How do businesses get engaged? How do we keep them engaged? How do we train people? How do we make this the economic driver of the future? Sustainable development is a core central value for most people. They want better lives, they want healthier environments, they want their children to be healthy and safe. That is central to an urban agenda. And now we need to be able to make sure that we're thinking about how we do the training and inclusive development patterns to allow for people to have those that quality of life that they're expecting.
Can I just say something here? I think that's such an important point. But in Hong Kong, I do not think we have communicated sufficiently to the young people that there are great jobs available in the sustainability and the climate change agenda. We've not reached, and we're not talking necessarily, we're talking about young people in the whole society. So we're not necessarily talking about just people who get to go to university and get to go to engineering school. In the digital age, in waste management, in energy efficiency, in water efficiency, we need so many new people who can turn this, use data, comfortable with digitalization, which young people today are, and that there are jobs for them. We're not doing very well in communicating that.
Roland, what's motivating the private sector to engage in climate change? Is it profitability? Is it the need for market certainty? Is it establishing new markets? Or is it corporate responsibility? Or is it just a strong business plan, business model?
I wouldn't pick any of those. I would say it's all. It's obviously profitability, it's market readiness, it's also CSR. I think for businesses, what's critical is to have a long-term framework within which they can make decisions. So it's absolutely about the long-term profitability. And businesses believe that we need to act. And many of them have taken targets. They have developed the processes internally to live up to those targets. But what they also need is what you just said, that clear signal that we are going in this direction. And the Paris Agreement was a very clear signal. Now I think that really still needs to be translated down to the national and the local levels so that we all sing the same song. Sometimes I feel there is not yet the same song everywhere, and I think that needs to align. And I think what you've just said is beautiful, because unless we make sustainable development something we all want to get to, we will not get there. I recently heard somebody talking about a self-fulfilling prophecy in a very different context. But we need to make sustainable development a self-fulfilling prophecy. If we believe in it, and if governments, cities, and the private sector, we say, this is where we want to go, I think that's when we'll get there. So it is all of this.
Let me challenge you then a little bit. If the business model is so strong, why don't we see more actions then? Is it that the business model is strong, but the communication and the awareness is not as strong? If it's a very strong business model, if it's profitable, you would expect to see more businesses engaged and more actions on the ground.
I think we see a lot of incremental change, and we see a lot of action happening where it is in your current business capacity to do. What's harder to do is the transformational change, where you cannot do it alone. And again, just the example before, in the building sector, we really need an instrument that helps the whole sector to align behind those targets. Because companies are already taking targets, but they take it on a narrow scope of what they can influence directly. And so I think that's the next step. There is a lot happening, but it just doesn't add up, as John showed us very nicely with his figures earlier today.
Okay, so how do we take the actions and make them exponential? Is it a mainstreaming platform? Are there mainstreaming activities that the private sector, that cities, that national governments can take forward? Pekka, the 10YFP is a mainstreaming platform. Where do you see that fitting in and helping to deliver against targets?
I think we have quite a wide network that is already engaged with this 10YFP action, and the intention is to mainstream those good examples that we can find from other places. What is important there, what I find essential, is to look at the local adaptation, how you can customize the solutions that have functioned in some other places, how they can fit with the local market. And I hope that in the future, like in the next conference after the one 3 years from now on, we wouldn't need to talk even any longer about sustainable buildings. So they should be already the mainstream practice by that.
And a lot of what we talk about are kind of the major stakeholders in the building sector, whether they be national governments, cities, major companies. But there are a number of vulnerable populations that are not yet engaged, but the impacts of climate change are very real to them. Gregor, and work with you in Habitat, how are you addressing the impacts of climate change on women, on children, on poverty-stricken populations, those who have limited means for engagement?
I think Christiana early on mentioned the fact how interlinked the SDGs are. And obviously achieving the SDG on gender equality will be very difficult if we do not address climate change. I don't know if I can ask the gentleman in the room, which is the SDG on gender equality? Does anybody know? 5? Okay. It's a small test. But also so the first step, I think, is to be aware of what the impacts are. At the rural and urban level, obviously the issues are different. So in the rural sector, a lot of opportunity costs for especially women and women-headed households are due to fuel wood and also maintenance of housing. So there are a lot of projects which are going on at the grassroots level in rural Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, also rural Asia, that try to tackle this issue and to give a bit of prominence to one of those initiatives. The First Lady of Narok County in Kenya has identified the fact that women spend a lot of their time fixing housing, collecting fuel wood, and obviously this is then also affecting their opportunities later on. So trying to identify those projects and supporting them as much as possible is really important. Now, in the urban sector, you have obviously also impacts related directly to energy efficiency. So to give another example again from the India housing program, which is quite forward-thinking in a lot of ways, and that, for instance, it requires for families that apply for a unit that both husband and wife are on the title deed, which is fairly not a given in a lot of these countries. But it also, for instance, gives right of first refusal to female-headed households. Now, these female-headed households, for instance, tend to have a lower median income, right, than male-headed households. So even if you provide a subsidized unit, which is a positive step, it would not be a positive step if then households which are already economically constrained to then have to deal with exorbitant utility bills later on, right? So policymakers and all kinds of stakeholders have to be aware that these are the impacts, and unless we think ahead and look at what I was talking about in the presentation, what is the actual life cycle impact of whatever we are providing in terms of housing, is also looked at. Now, obviously, the underlying sad reality in the question is that women do spend a lot more time in the home, and I hope that is the one thing that is going to change over the next number of years, that we all are equally affected by those issues.
Thank you. Christiana, I think one of the limitations has been essentially the long time horizons that have been talked about. People think of what we need to do by 2030, what we need to do by 2050. Today, you talked about what we need to do by 2020. But some of the discussion is about increasing collaboration to scale up action. Collaboration takes time, it takes finances, it takes resources. How can this sector really mobilize to do something at the pace that you say is necessary?
Well, it is a very good question, and it does take time, and as we proved, it took us 6 years to rebuild confidence in a collaborative approach to be able to come to a global agreement. But we did it in 6 years. And that was bringing 195 countries plus all the stakeholders in every single country together. So I think that's a very good example that if you have a very clear target, and if you have a timeline, and if you have transparency, and if you do it together, you can actually do it. So, you know, it's a pretty good song here that we have that can be followed. But it is critical to be mindful of the time, right? Because I think the lock-in and lock-out are two concepts that we really have to understand. If we lock in the level of emissions that we're locking in through the built environment, thank you, John, brilliant presentation. But if we continue to lock that in, we have literally locked ourselves out of the possibility of a stable environment, of a stable economy, and of achieving the SDGs. So we tend to think about the lock-in of emissions without thinking of the consequence, which is locking out the scenario that we really want. So we have to get that into our heads, right? If we lock one thing in, we're locking the other. This really is about choosing which way we're going to go. And honestly, it's not that difficult, right? Because the risk and reward ratio between these two things has totally shifted. And I would actually argue one of the reasons why the business sector is coming on board is because they have realized that there is much more reward than risk, which is not where we were 10 or 15 years ago, right? So the risk-reward ratio has shifted, and we have to understand that not just from a business perspective, but from a collective perspective. There is so much more to be gained, and the risks are so huge about the other scenarios. So let's be very clear. We're standing here in a choice that we're making as humanity. And the consequences of that choice are consequences that are going to be felt by humanity for the next hundreds of years. So, hello, do we have a decision to make? There is only one decision. So, no excuses.
Okay.
And you know,
finances and resources.
They can all be asked to sing the song, right?
Yes.
They can all be, you can
as
all
long
do
as
it
you
now,
put
right?
music to it.
The 40, you can all do it. Can we all go home and do it in your organizations?
Exactly.
It's a good start.
Financing and resources, discuss among yourselves. Where do we generate the
Well, you know, I do
revenue?
think government is important here because we can put some resources towards this. So we know in Hong Kong, we're not quite all there yet. The private sector is not yet with us fully, but government, we put out $500 million Hong Kong over the course of the next 5 years to stimulate the energy efficiency market. We're using our own buildings. So my colleagues have now looked at, they've done energy audits for 350 government buildings. This is a starter pool of serious learning. So we have the data, we know what to do, we can collect the data, we can keep analyzing the data going forward. We put out the money so we can actually hire people from the private sector who can start to do this. There's the Hong Kong GBC, the Hong Kong CIC, they're all aligned with government on this. Then you reach out to the private sector. I mean, the thing about government is, you know, the private sector and government can work together. And you know, the 40 song is very mild, but one thing is, people do know government can change the law. People do know that government can tighten standards. We need to tell them we're going to do that. Now, I guess in different jurisdictions, legal reform can take time. And it takes a while to work out what's your next reform stage. So we can ask, however, government can ask the private sector to go beyond compliance because we are going to tighten the law. Let's work with the private sector and say, we give you an opportunity. You want the certainty. We give you an opportunity to work with us. We have the experts to tell us how far and how fast we can go. We can put some money out there to trigger this process. Surely in the next 5 years, you can all meet a higher standard. It's not good enough for 2 degrees, never mind about 1.5 degrees. But let's take that first step. And I think what you tried to do, Christiana, is to inject optimism that we can do something if we wanted to. And secondly is there is this ratchet mechanism in the Paris Agreement, and I really do want to emphasize that. So what the countries have done is we have pledged what we're going to do. After 5 years, we have to give a report. Secondly is the Paris Agreement asks us to put out more commitments. That's the bit we also keep saying to the private sector. We tell them that we're serious, And we're going to come back in a matter of 1 or 2 years to ask them to commit, and we're going to change our laws. That's a powerful message for business.
Yves Laurent, as the presidency of COP21, France made buildings and construction a high priority in the Lima Paris Action Agenda. That led to the Global Alliance for Buildings and Construction. Where do you see the needs, opportunities, and challenges going forward, and how can all of these stakeholders collaborate to increase the pace and scale of actions? You can come up here. Take this. Come up.
Yeah. I'm not going to sing a song, even if I have a microphone. If someone wants to hear me singing, I'd be glad to somewhere else. Now, we've been talking a lot about, maybe I should clarify, what is Global Alliance for Buildings and Constructions, because we've been talking a lot about that and nobody really clarified it. I just want to say that the Global Alliance for Buildings and Construction was launched at COP21, and it's just like 25 countries and more than 70 partners, including WGBC, WBCSD, lots of Ws, WRI, and others. And this was to make the case and to upscale to make the case about buildings, basically, because believe it or not, it was not really considered before. So the first result of COP21 for us was to have a Buildings Day, and it was very useful, and it reached, and in some way, one of the good and positive things that happened then, and that should make us optimistic about the future, is that it raised lots of expectations. So, and there's lots of expectations from people about the building sectors and what it could deliver. So John has been saying that, and so we are acting in basically 5 ways to, of course, on public policies, on finance, on measurement, on raising awareness, and market transformation. We had a few results just after a year and a half of existing. That's issuing a global roadmap at the global level, what has to be done within the building sector. It's all on globalabc.org website if you want to have a look at it. A global status report, and lots of other things, including a clean energy ministerial campaign that is going to be launched tomorrow in Beijing. So regarding the question, I'm sorry. I think we're facing, we don't have to be blind about the difficulties we have. I mean, building sector is lots of decisions, it's billions of people deciding that they will choose to waste a little more money in their house than in their car or in the studies of their children. So it's not an easy thing. So I think we, thanks to all the people here around the table, we are raising an important consensus of that there is no choice. And people can understand that. For example, in the French campaign for presidency, all the candidates have been speaking about energy efficiency in buildings. So I think it's a very good sign. And I think we should pursue that. And probably other places in the world, things are happening this way. And I think this is very, very good. So what we have to do is to change that. And this is a long-term question, and it's not easy. Even if we have to take this decision now, we have to take these decisions for a long-term question. And this is not easy to convince people to take decisions now for long-term. So anyway, this first step here is raising consensus. Second step is, I think, raising partnership, because it's not only local authorities and governments, but it's lots of other people. It's architects, it's engineers, it's investors, it's banks, it's lots of people that we have to convince And I think we are working on that, and this is really going in the right direction now. And lots of those people who, even 5 years ago, didn't take into account all those questions already do. So I think this is a good sign. So, and the other thing I think is that on this consensus, we begin to realize that sustainable building is not only good for buildings and good for governments and good for, but it's also good for economy. It's good, it's job creating, and it's lots of opportunities for lots of people. So I think this is the major driver for changing. Of course, it has to be the main driver probably to have a strict and a clear way, a clear direction in public policies and at a global level. But I think the best is that all the people are convinced on their own that this is good for job, this is good for health, this is good for economy. And after all, I think the building environment is where we live, so this is good for life.
Thank you very much. We're about out of time, but I want to just give Christiana as our keynote speaker and special guest just a minute to tell us really what do we need to do between now and 2020? Just reinforce the message that you've already given to us. And what is it that you'll say in your 2020 keynote address at the World Sustainable Built Environment Conference? Just give us a preview of what you'll say in 3 years.
Okay, I like that. So, the preview, not only that I will say, but that everyone in the sector must come in unison to sing, is that the building and construction sector has truly understood the huge responsibility and the huge opportunity that they have. You know, the fact is that when you start from a very high level of having already gone through the transformation, such as the energy sector, then you still have a way to go, but the impact perhaps is not as huge. When you start at the low level, that John has been very clear in telling us, there's a huge opportunity, right? Because you're coming from way behind. So there is a huge opportunity to play a role here in helping the world to deal with this challenge and to do that in a profitable way that helps both builders, users of buildings, and certainly the inhabitants of the buildings. So how would we not want to do that if it's a win-win-win? So the song that we will sing in 2020 is "We Did It," because I do expect copious plans from all of you of this is the way that we are planning to decarbonize our sector. Decarbonize the sector. It's not about emission reductions anymore. It's about decarbonizing the sector. And I actually have a deep faith that that's going to happen. So thank you to all of you for contributing to that, and feel very proud of yourselves from now until then, but in particular in 2020.
Thank you very much. Please join me in thanking our panelists.